So without then further ado, let me introduce our guest today, Ingrid Grenon. Ingrid is a Maine native, though she lives in Massachusetts right now. She tells me she doesn't really like it very much.
Are you supposed to stand? No, I don't like Massachusetts.
You can stand if you wish. Anyway, Ingrid is a wonderful person, and I'm sure that will come through to you. She's very informal, so I think the setting suits your style today. So she'll be, I think, interested in whatever questions you have. She is many things. She is a poet. She has a book on poems out. She's also an author about the subject she's going to talk about today, coastal schooners. And she's also a blacksmith and a person who is very much interested in horses. She can answer an awful lot of questions, but she comes from a background that's pretty varied, and she brings a lot of experience with her to whatever it is she's talking about. So she has, incidentally, before I just ask her to say a few words, she has 2 books on schooners, which is her topic today, and they're over here on the table, and she'd be quite happy to help any of you who are interested in buying that at the close of the session. One of the books is entitled Lost Maine Schooners. That's her first book. And then the second one, which came out last year, is Down East Schooners and Shipmasters. So she's got a lot of background, a lot of experience talking about this traditional Maine vessel. Her topic today is coastal schooners and writing about them. So without further ado, I turn it over to Ingrid Grenon.
Hello, thank you all for coming. I'm going to be standing, a combination of standing and sitting, partially because I've got some herniated discs from all that horseshoeing I did. I did some draft teams and big draft horses and everything, so I'm going to be standing up and sitting down. I got started with this, and it all started, actually, I have a confession to make. My first book, Lost Maine Coastal Schooners, primarily focuses, it's about coastal schooners, 4, 5, and 6 masters built here in Maine. But if you've read my book, you can see that the schooners that we called the Wiscasset schooners, the Hesper and the Luther Little down the road there, those are my favorite, those are my beloved schooners. Those schooners I saw when I was 4 years old, and never forgot them. And from that moment on, I've been mad, crazy for these vessels. And as I got older, of course, I learned more about them. Than before 4 years old, you know, you don't really care a lot about technical stuff. But I do have a confession to make. In 1964, when my parents were at a clam bake here in Booth Bay, before I saw the Wiscasset schooners, and I was, this morning it's low tide, and I had to wait till it was a lower tide, and I drove around and I saw that hulk out there. Now, that was the very first. I think that's what was left of the Edna McKnight. That hulk was the very first thing I remember seeing out of that car window that morning of the clam, going home from the clam bake. It was hot. It must have been 95 degrees or hotter. It was as hot as it ever gets in Maine. I think it was obviously this summer. And I remember looking out the window and seeing that she looked a lot better. Well, this was 49 years ago, so she looked a lot better than she does now. But I just, oh my God, it's a ship. I couldn't get that out of my head. I just couldn't get it out of my head. I think I was speechless. And then when we drove down Route 1 and went over the bridge into Wiscasset, there were 2 more of them, only those 2 had masts. I mean, well, the Luther Little had masts, the Hesper didn't. And that was it. They couldn't. I started jumping up and down the car, and I was screaming, ships, ships, ships. Well, my parents probably thought I'd jump out the window if they didn't stop. And I got out and I stared at them. People who've never seen these vessels, of course no one else is going to get to see them now, don't realize they were over 200 feet long. So when you're in the shore, these things are massive. And when I was 4 years old, I couldn't believe that a boat could be that big. So my very first book where I mentioned Wiscasset schooners is a book of poetry. And I hope you'll Lots of folks don't like poetry, but I think you'll like this one. But this is how I started writing about coastal schooners. Now, we remember these. These are the ships that I saw when I was 4. And here's a picture of, this is the Ghost Fleet here in Boothbay. Of course, this was before my time. This was probably in the 30s or 40s. But these are some of the vessels out there. And there's something about it's almost like a sunken ship on land. It's just, I just can't explain it, but you all are from here, around here, right? I mean, it's just something you can't explain when you see something like that. So, if you'll just give me a minute to read this poem. And it's a very simple poem, and this is all it says. For hours I stood as a child, spellbound and beguiled, watching the schooners that were run aground and scuttled humanely off the coast of Maine. They had outlived their usefulness, I guess. One tipped with the mast broken off, submerged in the muck. The other, bowsprit loose, spanker stuck below the stern, she still had some rigging attached. Many years passed, and I was drawn back just to watch the old hulks. I came to visit them at low tide so I could get closer. It seemed sacrilegious to look upon them this way, in such decay. Perhaps it was morbid curiosity, or something more. These were the last of the 4-masted schooners. Were they just ships, or a way of life that was gone? I wanted to mourn, but instead, I wondered why the sea doesn't always bury your dead. And that was what got me started on writing about schooners. Excuse me? I'm sorry, I don't hear good.
Do you want to pass the pictures?
Oh, yeah. I got so excited about reading my poem, I forgot. I like to bring history into people's life. I love history, and I especially relished reading about these coastal schooners as I was learning more and more about them. But what I didn't like was having to force myself and suffer reading through dry maritime history books. And I wanted to get the knowledge out, but it seemed like I shouldn't have to suffer. So I thought, I'm going to write books that I'm going to give them a good dose of information, but I want them to enjoy it. Reading should be something we enjoy. And I like to bring chunks of life into my books. And this is the Lewis Isle Bridge. And this is a picture I took at sunset. Obviously, that's the bowsprit of a 2-masted schooner. That's the Lewis Isle Bridge. And she was built in 1871 in Christmas Cove, not too far from here. And I took a ride on her a few years ago. And here's another picture from the Lewis Isle Bridge of the Mary Day. The Mary Day was built in the 20th century. She wasn't old, but you can still get out on a schooner and do this stuff. This is the Snettenden. She's a 4-masted schooner that came from the west coast, and she came to Bath to be rebuilt. She had gasoline engines on her, diesel engines, and she came to Bath to have the engines removed and have topmasts put on it to make her a real sailing vessel. And that's the last sailing vessel that they actually did work on in Bath. This is a 5-masted schooner, and these are just pictures of different schooners. You know, we've got 2-masted schooners and we've got 7-masted schooners. There was one 7-masted schooner, the Thomas W. Lawson. The only 7-masted schooner, she was pure sail. She had steam operated hoisting engines, that's all. She had a steel hull, and she was notoriously difficult to handle. And she was built in Massachusetts, so like, they had to mention it. There was only one of them. It's a 2-masted schooner. This is one of, there were only 10 6-masted schooners built. 9 were built in Maine. A 3-masted return schooner. There's some pictures. And I just have to say, oh, this is the Dorothy Barrett, a five-masted schooner going down. U-boats used to sink wooden vessels all the time in World War I. They used to fire a warning shot, usually over the bow of the vessel, and they let the sailors get in their yawl boat and get off. But anyway, and here, this is Boothbay Harbor. These are the houses.
That's the Dorothy Barrett.
That's the Dorothy B. Barrett, five-masted schooner. They went down, I think it was 1918. Okay, now, I like, being as I like to bring, Bill kind of got scared when he saw all these books here. Now, I'm not going to read to you forever for hours and hours. I just wanted to give you a little idea of my style. And,
I wasn't scared, I was impressed.
okay, so I want you folks to know, when I was a kid, I thought the Wisconsin schooners were built in Maine. I assumed they were built in Maine. I saw them in Maine. And my grandfather one day said, you know, he goes, those ships you like? I said, yeah. He said, they weren't built here. I said, what? What? Wisconsin schooners weren't built in Maine? What, are you crazy? What's going on? He said, no, they were built in Massachusetts. Years went by and I started to research the vessels, and actually when I did a lecture at the Maine Historical Society a few years ago, the whole room became silent. Then I heard, when I told them that the Wisconsin schooners, the Luther, Little, and the Hesper, were built in Somerset, Massachusetts. Did you folks know that?
Yep.
Some did, some didn't. So I went to Somerset. In Somerset, the family whose idea it was to build the first five-masted schooner, the Governor Ames, and the ship designer was from Taunton, the next town over from Somerset. It ended up being built in Waldoboro. But the family was from Somerset, Mass. And it's interesting, this connection between Somerset, Mass. And Maine schooners, because the Wisconsin schooners were built in Somerset, Mass. The Hesper, the smaller of the two, the one that still had the masts, was built in 1917. She was the second Hesper. The first Hesper burnt on the stocks at the boatyard, the shipyard in Somerset. And in my first book, I have a whole description of newspaper articles from 1917 talking about the Hesper catching fire and all that. No, I'm sorry, the Luther Little. I'm getting old. The Luther Little caught fire. The second Luther Little was launched in 1917 in December. And the Hesper was a little bit larger than the Luther Little. She's the one that didn't have masts. In the 30s, a shipwrecking company from Portland came to take the masts, to remove the masts and the donkey engine and anything that was of value from the Hesper. And that's why the poor thing sat for almost 66 years with no masts. But she was the larger of the two. They were sister ships to the point where they were built in the same shipyard, and they were built one right after the other. First the Hesper, first the Luther Little, then the Hesper was launched in 1918. She was supposed to be launched on July 4th, but she got stuck on the stocks. And the Hesper, I won't go into the story about the Hesper, but she was a cranky old thing because she lost her anchor in Boston Harbor a few times, and had to be dragged off the mud in several different places. But she started her career off the wrong way. But the reason I'm telling you this is because I just wanted to illustrate. I figured I had to go to Somerset. I didn't want to just pick up an encyclopedia and write about Somerset. And this is what I say. I knew that if I were to do justice to the story of the schooners, the Wisconsin schooners and the Governor Ames, I knew I would need to visit the town of Somerset, get a whiff of some of the salt in the air, and look out over the Taunton River, where the ships would invariably have sat at anchor back in that era. Back during a time when the air was fresh and crisp, the clouds billowed as white as the sails, and there were no streams of corrupting black smoke rising upward to infiltrate the heavens. So, I tell you that, and now you're with me, and I'm pulling into the parking lot, and this is what I tell the reader. Pulling into the parking lot of the old brick school building that housed the Somerset Historical Society, I could not help but notice the sign in front of the building. It unmistakably depicted a Maine five-masted schooner under full sail. Yes, folks, the sign in front of the Somerset, Massachusetts Historical Society has this beautiful vivid picture of the Governor Ames, which was built in Waldoboro. Because if you go down the road to Waldoboro, you'll see a sign with a picture of the Governor Ames, but the Somerset picture is larger. Which I thought was strange. Okay. I could have parked anywhere, but I turned to the left and stopped my vehicle, settling for a nice spot overlooking the Taunton River. I sat for a moment taking in the view. Then I opened the door and slid down onto the running board and out of my truck. I noticed as soon as my boots hit the earth that there was a special quality about the place. There was something quietly stirring in the air, sort of a slow rambling momentum in cadence with the river itself. And this is how I like to get people into history, because this is how I would like to hear it written myself if I was the one reading it. I also like to bring people into the story. This is Governor Ames.
Nice guy.
He was a governor of Massachusetts in 1888 when the schooner was built. He doesn't look too happy,
No.
but nonetheless, that's him. And this is Captain Cornelius Davis, and it was the Davis family. They were entrepreneurs and shipmasters in Somerset. And it was the Davis family, it was their idea they commissioned the largest four-masted schooner that was ever to be built, and the Taunton, Massachusetts ship designer said, I think we better put a fifth mast on this. Well, no one had ever done it before, and that's Cornelius Davis. And by the way, this is a picture of the Governor Ames, first five-masted ocean-going schooner. And here's a picture of the Governor Ames with Cornelius Davis's two children on the deck. And if you look close, it looks like, I think that's their mother looking out the window in there. But, and their dog, and they're both holding rag dolls. And this was in the 1890s, and the Governor Ames was on the West Coast for the lumber trade out there. And Captain Davis took his children, his wife and children with him. The Governor Ames, a five-masted schooner, yes, she sailed around the Horn. At that time, she had a centerboard. She was the only large schooner to ever be built with a centerboard. One of her masts was off to the side, so because of the centerboard, but later in her career, they removed it so they could get more cargo in there. It was all about money after all, I guess. And
They removed the centerboard?
they did, from the Governor Ames, yes.
Did they put a keel on it?
I
How did they manage to
I
get
don't
away
know,
with?
I don't know about that technical stuff, but I know that she did okay after they did whatever they did to her.
It's very strange.
It boggles my mind to think about it.
None of the big schooners had keels, the keel was the backbone, but they didn't have like a sailboat, current sailboats.
Right.
That to replace the centerboard, that's why they made a lot of leeway.
They must have made a lot more leeway when they take the centerboard out.
Well-
They made a stand amount of they all did.
Right.
This was the only big schooner to sail around the Horn. And it got a little scary, but I think the only reason that he did it was because he had a centerboard at the time. This is Captain Joseph Davis, the brother to Cornelius, the shipmaster. And I have in my book his description, his eyewitness description of the ship. I got from the New York Times in 1888, and this is what Captain Joseph Davis, the fellow there with the beard, has to say. He says, my brother and myself were well pleased all the way the way the vessel behaved. This is her maiden voyage. And she gave evidence of being speedy and being a good seaboat. Excuse me. The wind breezed up from the south. Oh, geez. Sorry about this. Tuesday morning, the wind breezed up from the southeast and increased into a hurricane. The standing rigging became slack, and in spite of the fact that we kept setting up the foremast, she went by the board at about 9 o'clock Tuesday night. In falling, the foremast carried with it main, mizzen, and jibbermasts, leaving the schooner entirely dismasted and unmanageable. And he tells all about that. Now, the first five-masted schooner ever launched, her first voyage, she becomes dismasted. Well, it didn't take too long for them to, for the shipbuilders to build more schooners and more 5-masters and eventually 6-masters. But what I'm trying to tell you is that I incorporated the eyewitness account of this gentleman, and I luckily got his picture from the Somerset Historical Society, and I brought the history to life by the words of these folks. And I have also have an eyewitness account of what happened when the Governor Ames in 1909 was lost. And this is what it says. There were 13 persons on the Ames. There was one person that survived. All others were either drowned or killed, including the master, Captain King, and his wife. The latter, who was lashed to the rigging of the ill-fated schooner, was crushed by a falling mast. Nearly all those who drowned were terribly maimed before they went down. But this is an eyewitness account. And all throughout the book, I have eyewitness accounts. And I also incorporate my own observations. And if you'll let me, okay. As time marched on and the age of the sailing ship became further and further removed from daily life, I'm talking about the Wiscasset schooners now, the schooners became a tourist attraction. The stage was set. 2 weather-beaten, wooden-housed sailing vessels lying aground beside rotted docks against the backdrop of the Sheepscot River in Maine. The audience, all who passed along coastal Route 1 from 1932 until 1998. Nearly everyone who drove through Wiscasset succumbed to their strange magic, and I think they did. This is a picture of a fellow who climbed aboard the Luther Little and Hesper in the mid-70s, 3 or 4 times. The last time the Wiscasset police made him come off and told him he couldn't go on anymore, they'd arrest him. And he managed to get a lot of really good pictures, which I'll pass around. But he sent a picture to Richard Nixon, and he was invited to the White House. Larry Lufkin was his name. He passed away a few years ago. He was from Windsor, Maine, and he went to the White House and met everyone there with his picture of the Luther Little. So I think I have that here. I have some of his photographs here. And this is a Luther Little looking aft. This is the only color picture of it that I have with it. This is a Luther Little on the stocks at Somerset, Massachusetts, that I got courtesy of the Booth Bay Historical Society. And this was very good. Larry took this picture looking out from the galley of the Luther Little. I'm glad there was Wiscasset police were sleeping that day, or we wouldn't have these beautiful pictures. He climbed below deck, and this is a Luther Little. She's a little flooded, but. And this is a Luther Little here with the Hesper. Remember how she was tipped. And Larry got a lot more pictures, but these are some of my favorites.
Excuse
me.
Is this around the 70s? Is that what
In the
you
mid-70s, yeah. And luckily, the Wiscasset police weren't really doing their job too good. My last paragraph in this book, I say, many maritime authors see no value in the story of the last schooners. The large post-19th century hulks just aren't romantic. I don't agree. Sometimes the way a thing ends is much more moving and meaningful than the way it began. It was not only the Wiscasset schooners that seemed to be attempting to defy fate. Their massive gray hulks lying open to the sea and waiting beside docks that had long since rotted away and now just resembled bones sticking up out of the water. It seemed as if all of the large coastal schooners, even in their heyday, were tangible evidence of our reluctance to let go of an era, in this case the age of sail. The schooners clung stubbornly, a reflection not of the ships, but instead of the people who pushed them. In this way, the schooners become even more romantic than the most beautiful square-rigged vessels and storied whaling ships. We see ourselves in the schooners, as well as all that is honorable in humanity. I think that's one of the I think that's what some of the people saw in the Wiscasset schooners. I'm doing okay, Bill? I'm almost done here.
Okay.
This is a book written by a man who took a cruise, only it wasn't a pleasure cruise, but on the last 5-masted schooner, the Edna Hoyt. This is a rare book, and luckily for us, Charles Merriam got permission to get on the Edna Hoyt. And we have his first-hand account. He first saw her in Portland. Now, the Edna Hoyt was the last 5-masted schooner to be built. She was built in December 1920 in Thomaston. We know that Governor Ames was the first, built December 1st, 1888 in Waldoboro. But this is a fellow in, I think it was 1934 when he saw her, but he sees her first in Portland. And this is what he says. He almost causes an accident when he's in traffic and he sees the Edna Hoyt. This is what he says in 1934. He says, in these days of steam and calculated speed, large sailing ships are a rare sight. There was something stirring in the picture, something pulse-quickening, something that loomed against the background of Portland's venerable waterfront like an illustrated page of American history. Imagine seeing the Edna Hoyt. Large schooners are distinctly a product of American ingenuity, and he goes on and on, but that alone. And I was in the Edna Hoyt, and she comes upon some difficulty because there's rough seas, and he just can't believe, it's terrible. She almost went down. This was 1935, I think. And he says the captain stood calm, the raging elements were no new sight to him. The noble old schooner flew through the heaving wet hell for her life and ours. And hang on a minute. Okay. He went below, he goes below, I lost my bookmark here. Just please forgive me for a minute. Okay. I'm going to give this up in a minute. Okay, here we go. Now the captain goes down and talks to Mr. Merriam, because Mr. Merriam is he's just riding on this vessel, he isn't a crew member. And he goes down to Charles Merriam, and he says, I want you to know that we've done everything we can, my crew and I. I wouldn't care so much if it wasn't for my wife and children, they need me. It's hard for a woman alone. So this, Charles Merriam is listening to this. And then the captain says, it won't take long if she starts to break up. She can't take this pounding much longer. Nothing I know of could. No boat could stay afloat 10 minutes in the sea that's going on out there. And then he gives his passenger some advice. He says, there's nothing you can do. Just step over the side and get it over with as quickly and painlessly as possible. Okay, so this poor guy, I mean, this looks like it's going to be the end. And this is what Charles tells us. He says, my small copy of the Holy Scriptures, which had been given to me by a very dear relative, suddenly held new significance. But anyway, the Edna Hoyt makes it through, and she makes it through, and she stays working until 1937 when she has a problem. You can read about it in my book. But I also talk about a sea captain that loved her and bought her, Captain Harold Foss. He had a dozen coastal schooners in the the 30s and 40s, and he was running these schooners back and forth to Venezuela to pick up what he called gotina and sell it to fertilizer companies in the United States. Gotina, of course, was a euphemism for what you can probably understand. I think they call it guano in South America. But he made a lot of money and kept the schooners going for a long time. And I just have, if I can find it, of course I'm not going to be able to. But that's okay.
Yes,
Okay, we're good.
I'm sure there are a lot of questions.
Okay,
So, thank you.
yes.
I have a really basic question.
what does that word mean? You know, and is it, you tell me.
This is the story. The story is, there were so-called fore and after rigged vessels in the 1600s, but the word schooner supposedly comes from, in New England, a fellow was launching a boat. It was two-masted, fore and aft rigged vessel, and most of the other vessels were square rigged at the time. I think this was 1720 something. I can't remember his name. And whew, she goes into the water, and one of the fellows watching says, "My, how she schoons." And supposedly schoon was a Scottish word for I don't know what, but for schooling, for bouncing, moving with a rhythm or whatever. "Oh, my, how she schoons." And this fellow was supposedly have said, "Well, then a schooner let her be." And that's the official, I mean, I don't know how we can prove that. It's a nice story. Could have happened, but that's.
Several people have written it, so you got good company.
Yeah, I mean, that's the, I thought the same thing.
The argument is
I thought-
Dutch, and it doesn't work. The argument is it's a Dutch word, but no one has ever.
Well, the Dutch were the first to construct the, thank you, the Dutch were the first to construct the fore and aft rigged vessels in the 1600s. But supposedly the word schooner comes from the story that I just told you. But it was the Dutch, thank you, I forgot.
Good. Question?
What sort of crew would the Luther Little have?
The Luther Little was a four-masted schooner. Generally, the rule of thumb was 2 men per mast, plus the master, so she'd have a crew of 9. Such a huge vessel. I mean, I sailed on the Louis R. French, a little 2-masted schooner, and no, I wasn't strong enough to raise a sail by myself. I had to have help because that was quite a thing, even on a little schooner like that. So you probably wonder, with masts this big around, no, they didn't do it by hand. They had steam, they called them donkey engines or hoisting engines, and that's what made these big schooners so popular, why we had so many of them, late in history. With the steam donkey engine, the engine raised the sails. So these huge schooners could be operated with a small crew. There was always an engineer aboard, and he was one of the 2 men per mast. And the engine raised these huge, heavy sails and also helped with the cargo. But the Industrial Revolution in the latter part of the 19th century, it doesn't really make any sense because it's a paradox. Because the modern Industrial Revolution is what created the age of the last sailing vessels we had here, the big coastal schooners, because the steam donkey engines enabled small crews to handle these huge vessels and put a lot of cargo in them. They were only constructed to last 10 or 15 years. They weren't made to go forever. And they primarily transported coal, which is really hard on a vessel. And that's how they did it. 2 men per mast plus a master. The big 5 masters, the Edna Hoyt in the 30s, they had a hard time finding a crew to sail on a sailing vessel. If you went on a steam vessel or a diesel vessel, you knew you were going to leave port at this point, and you were going to get to where you were going to go at a certain point, and you could plan your life and tell your family or do this or that. If you were becalmed in a sailing vessel, you could stay there for a day, a week, a month. I mean, it wasn't good, and you didn't get paid anymore, and food got short. So people didn't really want to. They had trouble finding crews. So the Edna Hoyt, for one of her last journeys, the Edna Hoyt was sailed with only 8 men. Those 8 men were pretty damn busy. I can certainly guarantee that. I can't believe it. And during a storm, and they're constantly having to attack the vessel and do this and that and back and forth. They were up. At the end of this book, I have the last log of the Edna Hoyt. And these guys are up at 2 o'clock in the morning, tacking ship and doing this and doing that. I don't know when they slept, they must have been exhausted. And I'm sorry, I didn't know the one.
It's a tough job, in other words. Other questions?
What's next for you? What's your next venture? Do you feel you've told the story, or you're just getting?
I think I told a good part of the stories. If I find some more interesting information, then I'll do another maritime book. I'm doing a non-maritime book next. I'm working on it, but it has to do with Massachusetts, and I don't want to talk about it. I'm talking about sailing. You were gonna, you raised your hand.
I'm sort of thinking about this in the context, I work in the summertime at Castle Tucker up in Wiscasset, which was owned from 1858 up until 1997 by the Tucker family, and they were a shipping family there. And so I'm wondering, were they sailing ships like this? And, I mean, what, you know, were they sailing schooners to transport goods across the ocean?
From the latter part, from the first four-masted schooner, now this is the big coastal schooner phenomenon, the first four-masted schooner was the William L. White. She was built in 1880. And again, the big coastal schooner thing came with the Industrial Revolution. And they were turn schooners, three-masted schooners from the mid-19th century. But 1880 was the William L. White, the first four-masted schooner. And from there, it just went, it seemed bigger was better. The five-masted, six-masted, you know. And then the six-masted schooners, the first one was built in 1900. The last one, the Wyoming, was built in 1909. And that's just a little bit of, after that, with the exception of World War I, when the Hesper and the Luther Little were built, that was the last hurrah for the schooners, was the ones that were used in World War I for that trade. But, so that depending on the time period, in Maine, most of them, in Maine, especially the latter part of the 19th century through the early 20th century, it was most assuredly would have been a coastal schooner.
I think these guys were done shipping like in the 1880s or so, 1870s, 1880s,
Very
and they
likely.
started in the 20s and 30s.
Well, can I say something, Ingrid? And maybe Jim Hunt can support me or tell me I'm way off. But
I was going to
think-
suggest that you.
I think fore and afters were coastal schooners. They went north and south. So if the Tuckers, and I think all the papers Jane gave to Maine Maritime, they would have been square rig, brigs.
Yeah, did they go?
ships.
Where did they go?
They went across to Europe.
Yeah, so because of the wind
Okay,
patterns.
yes, then
you-
I didn't understand, yes.
So they would have
If
been
they
square
went-
riggers.
Yeah, because Barbara, who knows this area much better than me, the coastal schooners were called coastal schooners because they basically went up and down the coast, and the configuration of the masts worked really good
Okay,
for that.
all
The
right.
people going across the Atlantic would need some square sails to take better advantage of the wind and not.
Okay,
But
thanks.
now, the Hesper and the Luther Little did go to France. And several coastal schooners did go to Europe, but that was the exception rather than the rule. So I didn't quite understand, I just assumed it was on, you were
I
talking about.
don't
the East
understand
Coast.
it either. I mean, I'm just trying to to see if there's a connection, because I always think about them working there.
Yeah, but
But
Barbara's right, it depends on, if they're going up and down the coast, it would have been a schooner. But if they were going across the Atlantic, it would most likely have been a square.
Thanks, that's very helpful.
It was fairly common for a four-master built in that 1916, 17, 18 period. Pretty common for a four-master to go one trip across the pond. Because they could virtually pay for themselves in that one trip. The freight rates were so high as the shortage of bottoms due to the buildup of World War I in Europe.
Yes.
So it was very common actually for one trip across. Then they went into the north-south trade, as Barbara has described, you know, coal northbound, ice southbound, fertilizer, as you mentioned, lumber south, so forth and so on. The
But they-
coasting schools.
Thank you so much for mentioning that. During World War I, the idea was to get goods to Britain. And that was why, thank you, that was why, I mean, they made a lot of money. And the Hesper ran to France a lot, carrying oil but for the most part, they worked the coast. But in World War One, they made a lot of money bringing goods to Britain. If they didn't get shot, if they didn't get sunk by U-boats,
Some did.
a lot did.
You said something about bigger being better. Was bigger really better, or did they
Well, if you-
outpace?
Well, I think it depends on how you look at it. The Edna Hoyt could carry 55,000 tons of coal in her hold. If you want to get coal from point A to point B, that was better, I think. All depended on
Yeah.
what you want to do.
5,500 tons.
Excuse me?
5,500.
5,500 tons.
Yeah, it's okay.
Got
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
5,500.
My eyes are bugging out. Whoa, okay.
A little mathematically challenged. Thank you, sir. You're absolutely right.
Mike,
5,500.
you might mention, people might mention, that the Maine Maritime Museum is a fantastic diorama of the Little, Luther Little, and the Hesper. Made, the model builder, who was extremely skilled, then he actually burned them in a controlled way so that they, it's a diorama of those vessels as they sat there in their wrecked and burned condition.
Yeah, beautiful. Yeah, beautiful.
It's a fantastic.
Please go and see them. Are they still out there in the?
Well, they
there's-
were, I don't know, so, but when was I last there?
They're part of the
January.
permanent exhibit, I think so.
Yeah. The other interesting thing about the Little and Hesper, when they were being squaffed up and moved away, I went up and grabbed a couple pieces of that yellow pine that we used for planking. And you could cut it open to this day. I still got a piece. That was built in 1917. You could cut that open with a chainsaw and smell the pitch in that. That's why the yellow pine planking lasted. If you watch these ships here in Mill Cove, they deteriorated by the planking falling off of the rotting ribs, but you could still find all the planking from in the mud out there from the.
And I just looked at
Courtney
that one out there this morning in low tide, and I couldn't believe how intact the timber wood was.
Last thing I think, that picture you've got of all the ones in Mill Cove, that I can identify them for if you want to know which ones they are.
I used to know them, but the
They haven't
17E
changed.
Cliff was my favorite, and 17E Cliff was next to the Courtney Hulk. And the Edna McKnight was the Hulk that was dismasted. And
Freeman in the background.
I was told that when these schooners would come from the south, loaded with coal, and come into a storm, that they didn't have crew that could shorten sail at all. And so they just let the darn topsails blow away. That the crew was so small that they couldn't reduce sail and reef, and is that any truth in that?
yeah, I think there is. In this book, I've got the last log of the Edna Hoyt, which is a 5-mast. She was carrying coal, and she got damaged real bad in the storm. And the crew were up there trying. They're 2 o'clock in the morning. It's just. You're right. I mean, there's just so much you can do with a small crew, and they eventually were able to reduce most of the sail, and then sails tore. I mean, the sails would tear, and then that was it. But you're right. I mean, how could you possibly work these vessels were huge. I mean, the Louis French that I sailed on was only a little 2-masted schooner, and I couldn't even raise a sail by myself. And I just can't imagine these huge coastal schooners working there. Can you imagine it?
It's hard to do.
Oh,
Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
The ship came back with coal from south somewhere. What would it have been most likely to take on
if
the
it
way?
came from Boothbay, they might ice,
Right.
lumber from pine, different kinds of pine from different parts of the country. Railroad ties were common. Anything they could,
Right.
but they always came up with coal. most always, or yellow pine.
Let me ask a slightly, did you get it?
Okay, yep.
Okay, right. I don't want to cut off the discussion about the substance of Ingrid's books, schooners, and how they're handled and so forth, but I also want to open it up a little more broadly to the writing of the projects. And I just wondered if you would comment. One of the things I notice about your writing is, and you've done it here this morning, it's very much part of your nature. You use interviews, you use the spoken word, whether or not you acquire it personally by interviewing someone, or you acquire it by reading someone else's book who has interviewed it. Your books are very full of that, and I'm just curious about why that's the case. Why in the research process you go that way as opposed to some other way?
I want to write something that would be interesting to people, and I want folks to be able to get a little bit of knowledge from something, but I want it to be presented in a palatable manner. I want someone to enjoy reading about history by trying to breathe some life into it and using the eyewitness accounts, as well as bringing the reader with me to the Booth Bay Historical Society when I did the log of the Edna Hoyt, or to Somerset, Massachusetts when I visited where the ships were built, or on the schooner Louis R. Fresh when I sailed on her in the summer of 2011, or whatever. I like to bring people with me and sort of try to get them to experience or feel what I'm feeling, and present that in a palatable. I like to write books the way I like to write the books that I would like to read myself. I think that would be how I'd sum it up.
Okay. As I look around, I spot several people who not only read but write about this topic in some way, shape, or form. And so let me ask you about whether or not you have any advice on your own interviewing, after you've interviewed numerous people for these books, your two books. Any advice about the whole interviewing process?
I like to remember everything that happens when I go into an interview. I like to keep track of the weather outside, or all of these sorts of things in case I want to write about them. One thing I can tell you that's changed, I'm starting to get hard of hearing, so now I bring a voice recorder with me, and I never used to before, but now I find, although it takes a long time to transcribe it afterwards, I find that bringing the voice recorder enables me to get the whole conversation, not just part of it. And also, when I write something that I involve and I write somebody else's dialogue, I like to send that back to the person, or email it or send it to them, to make sure I got it right. Because a lot of times it's easy not to get something right, you know. And if I'm quoting a person or I'm putting dialogue in, I want to make sure that that person agrees with what I'm saying they said. And that's just another thing that I like to do. It's a good thing I did it, especially in this book, because I made a few mistakes that luckily the Hancock Historical Society curator, Lois, when she called me, she said, "Ingrid, I went over that stuff you gave me." And she said, "It all sounds pretty good, except." She says, "Do you have a pen?" and she went down. There were 3 or 4 things, and I had made real bad mistakes. And she laughed, and she said, "You know, folks around here, they're gonna pick that up right away." I said, "Oh, Lois, thank you so much. I can't believe I put that." So that's a very valuable, and I think, Barbara, we did the same thing. I sent you, there was something that I didn't do right, and I changed. I misquoted you or something.
Don't remember.
But you set me straight, thank you. I wanna, and you set me straight, it wasn't 500,000. 500.
I would bet that your interviewee, if you send the transcript back or what you've written, it would trigger more information that the
Sometimes-
interviewer hadn't given you in the first place, and said, "Oh, you had better add this."
Yeah, no, thank you, yeah,
I bet that would happen.
happens too, and I just, I just, to me, that's a real important facet of my interviews.
Right.
I do what I take it all down, and now I use a voice recorder, and then this transcript goes back to the interviewee, and I just need to make sure. And I can't stress that enough. If you folks are gonna do anything, please do that, because I've caught so many mistakes. It would have been very embarrassing for me. I mean, I've made a few mistakes, but the number of mistakes that would have gone uncaught are very frightening if I hadn't done that. Because when I'm interviewing somebody, I'm not the expert they are, and I'm learning from them. So it's important that I get what they say proper, correct.
Okay, thanks.
You said 2 years ago you were on the Lewis French.
Louis, our French, yeah.
Were you a crew member or did you just go for a
Well,
ride?
I just sailed. They knew I was gonna write a book, and one of my ancestors was a shipmaster. Yeah, he was born in Mount Desert Island, and he lost a schooner in 1876 in Portland when he was 71. But the schooner he lost was a General Meade. It was a two-masted schooner that was real close to the size of the Lewis R. French. And that's why I wanted to sail on the Lewis R. French. And plus, she was built in 1871 and pretty intact compared to the other dude schooners out there. She's pretty intact. And we can't escape the 21st century completely, you know. But so I sailed on her, and it was fantastic. And I take the reader on the sail with me. But the interesting thing is, one of my family names is French. And I did some research, and I found that one of my ancestors is a distant cousin to Lewis R. French, the man that built the schooner, Lewis R. French, back in 1871 in Christmas Cove. So that was a extra enjoyable thing for me to do that. But it was great. I'd suggest to anyone to do it, you know, to do it. I was afraid the group of folks I was sailing with would be, I just thought they'd be all weird touristy people. From Massachusetts, you know. But you know what? They were really, really good. There was a surgeon. There was another writer, and there was a filmmaker. But these people were regular people. They dressed like the rest of us in regular clothes, and they were all good people. And I have to say, my attitude was, oh, there's going to be tourists on here. That was a bad attitude. And everyone there was delightful. And although none of them were from Maine, with the exception of the cook, they all loved Maine, they enjoyed Maine. They were wonderful, wonderful folks. And I was very, very, very pleasantly surprised at the quality of folks that were aboard on that sail. I went for 4 days.
Any more, David?
No, that was nice.
That was a
Nice to
fun
hear that.
question. Thank you, Franz.
What's the difference between, my great-grandfather was a captain, and that was his title.
And master.
Is that the same as shipmaster?
It's the same thing.
What is it just experience? Because he didn't own a ship,
I think today there's so many hours that you have to have experience to be a captain or whatever, but back then, I mean, my ancestor, they called him Captain William Peachy, and he was master of the General Meade or whatever. He didn't have any certificates, I didn't think, or anything. They just called him whatever they wanted to call him, I think. Barbara, do you know?
I think it's the same as captain. It's just another word for it.
Yeah,
It's just the same.
It's the same thing, the only difference is when you sign on on the Coast Guard documentation, or the Department of earlier, the predecessor.
Well, there was a Coast Guard.
Documentation, you're signed on as master. In other words, you're the big number one, not the owner, but you're the boss, the master. The general terminology the crew would refer to you at, or anybody else, would be captain. But the master comes from the documentation, you sign on as master.
That's interesting. Yeah, I'm learning.
that's good to know.
Lots of information.
Okay, we've got time for one or two more questions.
It was an awfully short period of time, wasn't it, from 1880 till 1910 or 20, only about 40 years.
Yeah.
You figure 40 years ago, that's 1970. That was not long ago from my point of view.
No, it was quite a thing. It was the sailing vessel's last hurrah, I think. And the thing that I really like is,
But not only the last hurrah, but the first hurrah. Schooners, you say the first
well,
schooner was
yes,
built in
the
the
first and the
1880s.
last.
No,
I didn't,
first-
wow, I didn't
first
put
four
that in the
masters.
book. That would have
Yeah.
been the first.
First
Yeah.
format,
The
first
four masters, these
But the
coasters that were going up and down the shore.
And the thing is, most of them, by God, were built in Maine. And the coastal schooner thing is basically a Maine thing. And I'm just real proud of my ancestor who was a mariner and a shipmaster, a captain, or whatever he was. And all this stuff that happened here in Maine. Maine managed to forestall the end of the age of sail, right up until into the middle part, early part of the 20th century. And I think that's pretty damn good.
We talked about the end of sail, the very last four-master, the very last large wooden sailing vessel was built right here in Boothbay Harbor in 1921 with Josiah P. Chase. Built right in the front yard of those condominiums down there, which at that time was called the Atlantic Coast Company. On McFarland Point, not Signal Point, but McFarland Point is the real name of that place.
I love the Zebedee Cliff is always one of my favorite
That's not me
schools.
too.
And she was built, I know here.
She was
Yeah,
built
the
on
east.
the east side, on the East Coast Ship Company, which is where the Lobster Dock is today. For those who've been around a while, the Rodney Reed shipyard, well, that was the East Coast Ship Company in the World War
What
I. So one interesting thing about the Zebedee Cliff, she's a very interesting ship, but she had a tremendous amount of shear, which is the curve from aft forward, and the master who was from, they took her out of here, was a Southport fellow, Captain Plummer. He later took a line from the knightheads, which is the forward part of the rail, to the end to the stern rail. Run it tight, there was 13 and a half feet of shear curve in that part. That was, I won't take up your time, but it was, in addition to the beauty of it, there was a structural reason for doing that sort of thing.
And she ended up in
What
Portland
has to do with
Harbor.
hogging, yeah.
She ended up in the bottom of Portland Harbor as a,
Yeah, Casco Bay is breakwater, yeah.
yeah.
Going back to the distinction between captain and master, in those Patrick O'Brien books, this is about the British Navy, there's a captain and then there's a sailing master. Does anybody know the difference in responsibilities between those two? Can you describe it?
I'll try to. Anybody here remember Admiral William Royal from Ocean Point? Did any of you know him? He was a sailing master of the Constitution in the early 30s when it was still sailing around the world. I'm trying to think of a current thing. He reported to the master, but he was like a chief mate almost in a way, similar to a chief mate, but on a sailing vessel.
Okay, it
He's
sounded
not the commanding officer, he's not number one,
yeah.
but he was the chief sailor, I guess you could.
Yeah, it sounded in those books like the captain had military responsibilities. It sounded in those books like the captain had military responsibilities as well as
Oh, yeah.
overall command, but the sailing master didn't have military.
It's like you can put a boat in a ship, you can't put a ship in a boat.
My husband's great-grandfather was a sailing master out of Belfast. Did coastal
My
schooners and then
ancestor
went to
was
China, took his whole family on from, it's a bark. But if you see his name in a formal setting, as you say, on a document, it's master, it's Joseph S. Tom's master. But if you see it listed in who's sailing this week, it's very often, or a general article, it's Captain Joseph S. Tom. So it, like you say, maybe it meant something more legitimate, for insurance reasons or something, if you were listed as the master.
David, I think you probably need to pursue an answer to that question further. I haven't picked it up, though I'm a fan of those books. Probably a lot of people here are.
It just occurred to me, I remember reading that in those books and thinking, what's the difference?
Yeah.
Maybe it's
yeah.
But
different
it
because
was
they
a
were
military
naval
time
vessels.
too.
I
Naval
think it
vessels.
might be.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, but I would guess you made a good start at answering the question. So, okay, well, I think we're at the closing hour here. Anybody got a last question you're dying to get answered before we go?
When
Okay.
does the snow squall fall into the schoolers? The snow squall from this, in the Bath Museum, parts of it now? It was wrecked in Falkland Islands.
Clipper ship,
That's a clipper ship, okay.
the last clipper, I think.
The last one, that's how they.
Okay. Thank you very much.